History of the horror genre. In the 1920s, horror films started off in the silent era. This was where the villains in most films were played by actors who were portraying a normal person who was seen as being crazy. Examples of films that fit into this silent era include Dracula, 1931, Frankenstein, 1931. In films such as the above, a beautiful lady was always involved. A villain would also mess everything up. Films such as these were mainly aimed at a younger audience. Not as much violence were included, which is why the target audience was younger. Many films ended with the death of the villain. This was done in order for the audience to believe that they were safe. Audiences believe that every monster must die at the end of the film, so they are not haunted by the monster. People believed that the most terrifying monsters were humans themselves. Films such as Holocaust had a major impact on the audience and left the biggest impression. In the end of the 1930s and throughout the 1940s, the most terrifying horrors involved the horrors of war. Cinematic monsters became less terrifying compared to the horrors of war. The horrors of war made horror films seem comical. Monsters such as humans playing crazy people and humans dressed up in masks seemed comical compared to the horrors of war that Britain was facing in the 1930s and 1940s. Films such as Cat People, 1942, and The Leopard Man, 1943, showcased the audience their worst fears. Many audiences believed that psychological horrors seemed worse, which meant they were more common. Other films in the 1940s, such as Shadow of a Doubt, represented the film noir style. During the horrors of the war and the invention of the atomic bomb, horror films played on the fear of the audience by creating creatures of the bomb. This made horror films seem scarier towards the audience as they were all aware of the horrors of the war. A variety of different horror subgenres were filmed as audiences wanted a wide variety of stories. Subgenres of horror films that were shot after the 40s included scientific horrors, that included aliens out to get humans. Other films included a reflection on society which showed audiences that anyone who is different is bad. In the 1960s, horror films were shown where the audience were more involved. Items in seats got the audience more involved in the horror film, which increased the shock value. Over the years, the horror films have changed, from human beings that were crazy to the horrors of war and aliens out to get humans to communist takeovers. The horror genre has changed due to what the audience expects. In 1960, Psycho was a film considered a kids' film. The age of the audiences has decreased over the years and are aimed at younger audiences. The film Psycho shows the audience that nothing is off limits and that the most sympathetic character is the most horrible, and usually, in most cases, was the villain. On-screen value has also increased in the horror genre timeline. The shock value has also increased along with a theme of unpredictability and unawareness. As we move into the 70s, more sex and violence was acceptable. Horror films reflecting the anxieties of the 70s. Between 1970 and the end of the 80s, a cycle of slasher horror movies were screened. Films such as Nightmare on Elm Street. Since the year 2000, horror films have taken the form of previous horror remakes. Remakes of horror films from the early 60s have been screened since 2000, but have been developed and edited to suit the technological advances and different generations. And Frankenstein, 1931. In films such as the above, a beautiful lady was always involved. A villain would also mess everything up. Films such as these were mainly aimed at a younger audience. Not as much violence was included, which is why the target audience was younger. Many films ended with the death of the villain. This was done in order for the audience to believe that they were safe. Audiences believe that every monster must die at the end of the film, so they are not haunted by the monster. People believed that the most terrifying monsters were humans themselves. Films such as Holocaust had a major impact on the audience and left the biggest impression. In the end of the 1930s and throughout the 1940s, the most terrifying horrors involved the horrors of war. Cinematic monsters became less terrifying compared to the horrors of war. The horrors of war made horror films seem comical. Monsters such as humans playing crazy people. And there are many different iconic horror genre directors. I've done some research into three of these. The first one, Tobe Hooper. Tobe Hooper has been honoured with many awards for his films within the horror genre. Tobe Hooper is well known for directing the horror film that changed the horror film industry in many audiences' opinions. This film was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. Before he directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Tobe Hooper spent the 1960s as a college and documentary cameraman. Tobe Hooper is also well known for directing horror movies such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Poltergeist, and Salem's Lot. The second iconic horror film genre director is Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock grew up in a very strict Roman Catholic family. In 1920, Alfred Hitchcock managed to secure a job as a title designer in a studio in London. He designed titles for all the movies that studio produced over the following 2 years. In 1923, Alfred got his first chance at directing when the director of Always Tell Your Wife fell ill, so Hitchcock finished directing the movie. He went on to work as a writer, title designer, and an art director. When Hitchcock went on to direct his own films, he usually created horror films that had a twist at the end and had thrilling plots which included depictions of violence, murder, and crime. He chose to do horror films such as these from the audience involvement and what the audience expects. Hitchcock directed more than 50 feature films in a 60-year career. Hitchcock had a flair for narrative and cruelly withholding crucial information from the characters and the audience. This resulted in engaging the emotions of the audience more effectively. His most famous film he has directed was Psycho. George Romero. After graduation, George Romero began shooting mostly short films and commercials. He and his friends formed Image 10 Productions in the late 1960s, and they all chipped in roughly $10,000 to produce what became one of the most celebrated American horror films of all time, Night of the Living Dead, 1968. This film was shot in black and white and was shot with a budget of just over $100,000. In 1978, Romero returned to the zombie genre with the one film of his that would top the success of Night of the Living Dead, 1968. This was Dawn of the Dead, 1978. The decline of Romero's career came in the late 1980s. His last widely released film was the next Dead film, Day of the Dead, 1985. Derided by critics, it did not take in much at the box office either. His latest two efforts were The Dark Half, 1993, and Bruiser, 2000. These two films, like the previous, did not raise much at the box office, so horror films, along with all film genres, are certified by the British Board of Film Classification, the BBFC. Most horror films have the certificate ratings of either 15 or 18. As horror films are relatively scary, the certificate ratings must be higher as younger audiences should not be watching films like these. On-screen violence has increased over the years, and only older audiences should watch films like these. Also, in horror films, as the years have gone on, there has been an increase in on-screen sex scenes. Younger audiences should not be watching films that include an ample amount of on-screen sex or violence. Horror films are usually rated 15 or 18. However, audiences of a slightly younger age will also be a secondary audience for horror films. For example, a horror film that is aimed at an 18-year-old will also be second will also have a secondary audience of a 17 and maybe older 16-year-olds. For example, a film that is aimed at 18-year-olds would include 18-year-olds going to see this film at the cinema, but some 17-year-olds and possibly 16-year-olds would also try to get in to watch this film. This is exactly the same for horror films that are aimed at 15-year-olds. Some 14 and maybe 13-year-olds will also try to get in to watch the film at the cinema. When purchasing films like these on DVD, younger audiences are able to watch it, obviously through their parents' permission. This means that horror films, the producers and directors, and all the production and distribution teams involved will have to consider that younger audiences may be watching a horror film. The BBFC must also take this into account when rating it. They must watch the film and determine which aged audience would be the best. Different types of or, film classifications that the BBFC offer include a U. This is this is a universal symbol, which means that anybody can watch this film of any age. PG. This is parental guidance. This films that have this rating means that anybody can watch this film, mainly aimed at families, as long as parents have given permission for their child to watch this. 12. If a film is rated 12, then 12-year-olds and over are their primary audience. Secondary audiences of people who are slightly younger than 12 may also be included. 12A. Films that are rated 12A mean that 12-year-olds can watch this film, but anyone younger than 12 must have an adult to accompany them. 15. This means that films are aimed at 15-year-olds and above. However, some audiences that are younger than 15 may go and watch these films. 18. Films that are rated 18 are aimed at 18-year-olds and above. However, some 17-year-olds may also try to watch this film.